Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Andrew and today we're going to be talking about carbon offsetting. Carbon offsetting is going to be something that you hear a lot more about as climate change continues to progress. So today I wanted to go through the basics of what carbon offsetting is, how much it costs, how it's different from a carbon credit, and a couple other things so that you can know the basics to carbon offsetting. Simply put, carbon offsetting is paying to have carbon emissions either removed or avoided somewhere else in the planet to make up for the carbon that you are responsible for. Another way to put it would be that a person, business, or entity invests in a product or service that removes greenhouse gases from Earth's atmosphere. You can picture it kind of like a scale. So let's say that a company emits X amount of carbon and that tips it towards this direction of carbon emissions. And then they can pay for somebody to plant trees, they can fund a project or something, and those trees are gonna reabsorb the amount of carbon that they've emitted, so they're back in this balanced position, which is where they wanted to get through carbon offsetting. So let's look at an example of carbon offsetting as it might apply in your life. Let's say that you take a flight from New York to California. Your one seat is responsible for about 2 metric tons of carbon dioxide being emitted into the atmosphere. That means that you could pay to offset your emissions from that one flight. So at about $10, 1 metric ton, that would be a $20 carbon offset. That means that you funded a project that's gonna then take out 2 metric tons of carbon emissions from the atmosphere, and it's as if you never emitted those carbon emissions. It balances those scales. So that's how carbon offsets work. There are different kind of carbon offsets that you can buy. There's really 2 main kinds that you can buy, or 2 main methods for removing carbon from the planet. Each company that you purchase an offset from is gonna have their own calculating methods. They're gonna have their own methods to removing carbon. And so that's why I've grouped everything down into 2 major groups, and let's talk about each of those groups. The first major group is carbon offsets that act to store carbon or sequester carbon. So an example of that was planting trees. And so when you plant trees, they remove carbon from the atmosphere and then they use that carbon for other things. There's a bunch of molecular science there. But they take that carbon and they put it into their leaves, or they put it into it ends up in the soil, or it's stored for later. It can be stored in a bunch of different ways. And so the trees are essentially taking carbon from the air and storing it somewhere else so that it's not in our air and not in our planet's atmosphere, contributing to this global warming or this global climate change that we're seeing now. Carbon sequestration is good for certain amounts of time. It depends on what you're talking about. Trees will be different than other sorts of carbon sequestration. Generally, they can last, I think, about 100 years to even longer, but in the grand scheme of the planet, it's a pretty short-term solution. The other group of carbon offsets that you could buy or you could fund would be carbon offsets that avoid carbon emissions. And so that's really going to be with any kind of renewable energy source. So we can look at hydropower, wind farms, and solar power as 3 big examples. So when you purchase a carbon offset that funds a project that is based off of a renewable energy source, then what that carbon offset is doing is diverting fossil fuel consumption or greenhouse gas emissions from one energy source and putting that energy demand towards a renewable energy source that is cleaner. And so it's avoiding the carbon emissions that would come from using burning coal or burning gas, burning some kind of fossil fuel, and instead using the energy that is generated at the wind farm to power this region or this part of the city. And so you're avoiding the carbon emissions. And in that sense, that's how this carbon offset balances the scales. It's by saying that you or another person has emitted this much carbon, and so now by buying the carbon offset, you have balanced the scales because elsewhere carbon emissions have been avoided thanks to your funding. So there's this other thing in the business world called carbon credits. Those are not carbon offsets and they work very differently. You are probably not going to interact with carbon credits. You will be interacting with carbon offsets if you decide to purchase carbon offsets. Carbon credits are something that really apply to the business world. So a carbon credit is a permit, and oftentimes it's a legal permit or a legal permission to produce a certain amount of greenhouse gases. So let's look at an example of how carbon credits work. I know that this is a really simplified example. I just made it up myself, but it'll give you a better understanding as to how companies use carbon credits and how they work, as well as why some people might be against them. So let's say you're a company and you have a total of 100 carbon credits, or your government allows you to emit 100 units of carbon. So let's say over the course of the year that you only emitted 90 units of that carbon, you still have 10 units left over in your budget, essentially, that you could emit, but you're not going to. So what do you want to do with that extra 10 units? If you know a company that is over their limit, let's say that they also have a limit of 100 units, but they're at 110, they're going to get fined. So let's say that they get fined $10 every unit that they're over. They're 10 units over, that means that they're gonna get fined $100. You could say, hey, I have 10 extra units, I'll sell you my permit to emit those 10 units, $5 per unit. That will cost them $50 and you'll make $50. So rather than them paying the government $100, they've saved $50 by giving you that money and you've made money. That's essentially how carbon credits work. Because of that, carbon credits are a billion-dollar industry, and there's carbon credit exchanges and sales every single day, just like with carbon offsetting. It's a big industry. It is going to continue to grow as climate change worsens, as governments put restrictions on the amount of emissions companies can emit, as people continue to invest in clean energy or ask that their companies reduce emissions and so on. So now you know how that works for companies. Real quick before I move on to does carbon offsetting work? If you're finding value in this video, if this video is helpful, I ask that you give it a like and comment any questions you have. And if you would like to see more content like this, hit the subscribe button. That engagement supports my channel so that I can continue to make content like this. So now that we've talked about carbon offsetting, carbon credits, you might be asking yourself, does carbon offsetting work? And the answer is, it really just depends. I'm going to break this up again in two ways. We're going to talk about carbon offsetting for you and then carbon offsetting for businesses, because I think that depending on which entity is buying carbon offsetting can really influence how effective or how likely it is to make a difference. When it comes to carbon offsetting for you personally or for your household, you get to research the company you're going to buy from. You know who your money is going to. You know where your products are going. You have the ability to verify any claims or see that they are verified by third-party entities. And you really get to do the kind of research that can confirm what they're saying so that you know your money is going to funding reforestation or some other environmental cause. And so you really have a handle on where your money is going. When it comes to carbon offsetting for businesses, it's a lot trickier because we're talking about billions of dollars, we're talking about really large corporations and people with a lot of money. And just like any scenario, there are going to be people that do not want to do what is right and do not want to do the planet good. And so they're going to try to figure out how they can get around it. They're going to try to figure out how they can look like they're doing what they should be when they're not. And so that really complicates things. So it's a very different picture when we're looking at businesses rather than when we're looking at a single person or a home. A pro for business carbon offsetting would be that it gives people flexibility to reduce their carbon emissions when they're in an industry that they can't really change a whole bunch just yet. So an example would be with airlines. We don't have electric planes, and so they can't really reduce the amount of fuel they're consuming by a lot. They can't just, cut that out. And so airline companies can buy carbon offsets to reduce their overall carbon footprint, and that gives them the flexibility to do that. Another pro to carbon offsets is that it gives funding to projects that wouldn't normally get funded as much. So like I already said, carbon offsetting is a billion-dollar industry. Without that industry, that's billions and billions of dollars that isn't getting invested into renewable energy projects or reforestation projects. And so that is something that most people see as really beneficial. I also think that carbon offsets incentivize companies to reduce their carbon footprint without buying carbon offsets. Let me explain what I mean. Carbon offsets kind of work like a carbon tax. And so a carbon tax is basically however much carbon you emit, the government is going to tax you. That encourages companies to reduce their carbon emissions so that they can reduce their taxes. That makes sense. With carbon offsets, they're often voluntary, but when a company is paying so much money to have their carbon offset, they're also going to be inclined to reduce their carbon footprint so that they don't have to pay as much to balance out the scales. The cons for carbon offsetting in the business world is seemingly endless. We all know that many businesses are really out for their bottom line. They're out for profit, and they don't really care what they jeopardize when it comes to their employees or the planet. And so they're going to find loopholes, and they're going to exaggerate their green image in favor of the bottom dollar or their profit. And so that's just how the world works. And so there are a lot of cons, but I'm just gonna cover a couple. The first is that most people will say carbon offsetting is not a solution. What they mean by that is you can't buy your way out of the climate crisis. You can't continue to fund carbon emissions while you're emitting carbon into the atmosphere and expect anything to change. And I do think that's true. I completely agree with that. But as I said before, I think it gives people a lot of flexibility where they might not otherwise have the flexibility. And I think it also can work as a temporary solution while we continue to work on clean energy and to really change the systems that we use every single day so that they can operate more energy efficiently or operate more sustainably in whatever ways possible. Another major con with carbon offsetting is that people feel it gives certain groups of people or companies permission to emit more carbon. So an example of this on a personal scale would be, let's say that you take a flight from New York to California, and that's usually all the travel you would do. You've offset it, and so now the scales are balanced. You don't feel as guilty or you don't feel as responsible for carbon emissions that year, so you take 2 more flights in addition to the one you would normally take. Well, you're still emitting carbon emissions and you're still contributing to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, even if you're paying to offset them. We know that there are flaws with carbon offsetting, that it's not a permanent solution. And so that kind of increase in emissions because you feel like it's being offset doesn't really help anything. And so it kind of defeats the purpose of the offset. It kind of defeats the purpose of living sustainably at the moment. And so that's a major con for carbon offsetting. And I definitely agree. It applies the exact same to businesses as it did to that personal scale example. So, if they feel like they're offsetting their carbon by a certain amount, that they can let this action go or they can let this behavior slide because they're offsetting elsewhere. And that's just really the opposite direction that we want to be moving in. So how much does carbon offsetting cost? Well, again, it's going to be different for a large company, but for you, it's also very different. It depends on what you want to offset. So you could offset your whole household for an entire year. You could offset your household for a month. You could offset the emissions from your car. You could offset the emissions from a single flight. It really just depends on what you want to offset. Every company that you can buy from is going to have their own calculator, and you can calculate your car in there. You can calculate your heater. You can calculate your appliances, your food waste. You can calculate any number of things into that carbon footprint that you have for the set of time that you have given the calculator. And it's going to tell you how much money you should pay in order to offset what it is you want to offset. The best way to get a handle on exactly how much it's going to cost you if you want to offset for a year or for a month would be to just go look at the calculators. I'm going to link several calculators down in the description below, and you can check those out. They're super easy. They'll give you a number. You're not obligated to anything, and you can kind of get an idea as to how different calculators work and to what the cost for you is going to look like. The first one that I'm going to link below is TerraPass. They have a couple different options. They have a monthly or an annual option, and then they also give you the option to offset events like a wedding, travel, or flights. Native is the next one that I'm going to link down below. They give you the option to offset your carbon by tons. And so really what you'll do is calculate how many metric tons of carbon you emit per given amount of time, and then you can pay to have that amount of carbon reduced or removed or avoided. The next carbon calculator that I'm going to link, and the last one that I'm going to link below, is Clear. And so they have a pretty, it's kind of an itemized carbon offset calculator where you can choose different things to contribute to the footprint that you want to offset. And so I would also recommend looking at that one so you can kind of figure out maybe that one's the best one. Maybe you just want to offset your car and another thing, or figure out what options you have available to you. And so really that's everything that I have in terms of carbon offsetting. I'll see y'all here next time. Thanks for tuning in.